What would happen to your skin after 6 hours walking under a sun that burns at 120 degrees Fahrenheit? How would you survive 3 consecutive days in an environment where shade exists only at dawn and water is rationed like currency? Could you endure a night when temperature drops 50 degrees in 4 hours with nothing but 2 layers of woven fabric between your body and hypothermia? Why did entire civilizations depend on a piece of cloth that modern people would consider primitive, uncomfortable, utterly insufficient? And what if everything you think you know about survival in extreme environments is actually backwards? You're standing at the edge of what travelers in the 1st century called the Judean wilderness. Not a romantic desert with golden dunes and palm trees. This is a fractured landscape of limestone ridges, dry riverbeds that flood without warning, and soil so alkaline it burns through leather in months. The sun here doesn't warm. It punishes. By mid-morning, the ground radiates heat upward while the sky presses it down, creating a furnace effect that makes breathing feel like swallowing hot sand. Modern fabrics would fail here. Polyester would trap sweat against skin, creating a breeding ground for infection. Nylon would chafe raw wounds into any point of friction. Gore-Tex would become a suffocation device. But you don't have any of those options. You have what everyone in this era has: a tunic, a cloak, and the knowledge that these 2 items will determine whether you live or die. Look at the tunic first. Not the clean, flowing garment you've seen in paintings, the actual object. It's woven from wool or linen, depending on season and economic status. The weave is loose enough that you can see daylight through it when held up to the sun. This isn't poor craftsmanship. This is intentional design that took millennia to perfect. Each thread is spun by hand, twisted just tight enough to hold structure, but loose enough to allow air movement. The fabric weighs almost nothing. When you put it on, it falls to your knees, sometimes to your ankles if you're traveling through regions where modesty standards are stricter. There are no buttons, no zippers, no elastic waistbands, just a rectangular piece of cloth with holes for your head and arms, held in place by a rope belt made from the same material. Feel the texture. Run your fingers across the surface. If it's linen, it's smooth but not soft. The fibers are stiff, almost scratchy against skin that's used to cotton. If it's wool, it's coarse, with individual fibers that poke through the weave and irritate your shoulders, your sides, anywhere the fabric makes direct contact. This seems like a design flaw until you understand what happens when you start moving. The tunic doesn't cling. It doesn't hug your body. It hangs loose, creating a pocket of air between the fabric and your skin. As you walk, this pocket moves. Air flows up from the bottom hem, circulates around your torso, and exits through the neck opening. The loose weave allows additional airflow directly through the fabric. You're not wearing clothes, you're wearing a ventilation system, but ventilation alone won't save you when the sun reaches its peak. This is when the second layer becomes critical. The cloak. In Hebrew, it's called a talit. In Greek, a himation. In Aramaic, a glima. The name changes depending on who's speaking, but the function remains identical. It's a large, rectangular piece of fabric, roughly 6 feet by 3 feet, woven from heavier wool than the tunic. The weave is tighter, the weight is substantial. When you drape it over your shoulders, it pulls down with enough force that you feel it compressing your spine. This weight is not a burden. It's an anchor that keeps the fabric in place when wind cuts through the valleys at speeds that can knock a grown man off balance. Watch how it's worn. The cloak doesn't wrap around you like a modern coat. It's draped, folded, arranged in a specific configuration that varies by region and social custom. For travel through open desert, you fold it lengthwise and drape it over your head, creating a hood that shields your face and neck from direct sun exposure. The remaining fabric falls down your back and sides, covering the tunic completely. From a distance, you look like a walking tent. This is exactly the effect you want. The dark wool absorbs heat before it reaches the lighter tunic underneath. The air gap between the two layers creates insulation. The cloak becomes a portable shade structure that moves with you, maintaining protection no matter which direction the sun is shining from. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because what you're about to learn goes beyond simple survival techniques. This is the foundation of how human civilization adapted to environments that should have been uninhabitable, and the principles embedded in these ancient garments still outperform modern technology in specific conditions that most people never consider. Now walk. Feel what happens to these layers when your body starts generating heat. The tunic, already loose, begins to billow slightly with each step. The movement creates a pumping action, pulling hot air away from your skin and replacing it with slightly cooler air from outside. Sweat forms on your back, your chest, your shoulders. But instead of pooling against your skin like it would under synthetic fabric, it's absorbed immediately into the linen or wool fibers. The moisture spreads across the fabric's surface area, where the combination of air movement and low humidity causes rapid evaporation. This evaporation pulls heat away from your body at a rate that's faster than sweating alone could achieve. You're not just cooling passively. The tunic is actively extracting heat through a process that requires no energy input beyond walking. The cloak adds another dimension to this system. Because it's draped over the tunic rather than attached to it, there's constant movement between the two layers. Every step creates micro-adjustments in how the fabric hangs. Air pockets form and collapse. Hot air escapes from the sides while cooler air is drawn in from the bottom. The wool of the cloak absorbs moisture from the air, including the evaporated sweat from your tunic. When humidity is extremely low, this absorbed moisture evaporates from the outer surface of the cloak, creating a second cooling cycle that doesn't draw any additional water from your body. You're wearing a two-stage evaporative cooling system that functions without electricity, without moving parts, without any resource except the air around you. But cooling is only half of what these garments do. Temperature in the desert doesn't stay constant. By late afternoon, as the sun begins its descent toward the western ridges, the air starts to change. Not gradually, abruptly. Within an hour, the temperature can drop 20 degrees. Within 3 hours, another 20. By the time full darkness arrives, you're facing conditions that are the opposite of what you experienced at noon. The same sun that threatened to cook you alive is now gone, and the heat it pushed into the ground is radiating back up into a clear sky with no clouds to trap it. The limestone rocks that were too hot to touch 6 hours ago are now pulling warmth from anything that contacts them. This is when the cloak's weight becomes your survival tool. That same heavy wool that absorbed heat during the day now holds it. The fibers are dense enough that they don't release warmth quickly. When you wrap the cloak around your entire body, folding it closed in the front and tucking the edges under your legs as you sit or lie down, you're creating an insulated cocoon. The tunic underneath acts as a thermal barrier, keeping the warmth generated by your body from escaping directly into the cloak. The air gap between the layers becomes dead airspace, which is one of the most effective insulators available. You don't need a sleeping bag. You don't need a tent. The same two layers that kept you alive at 120 degrees are now keeping you alive at 50. Consider the mechanics of this reversal. Modern survival gear separates these functions. You have clothing for hot weather, different clothing for cold weather, separate layers for rain, additional items for wind. A complete kit for desert travel might include 15 separate pieces of equipment, each optimized for one specific condition. But in 26 AD, you have 2 items that handle all conditions, and they do it through principles that work with your environment rather than fighting against it. The tunic and cloak don't try to maintain a constant microclimate. They respond dynamically to whatever conditions exist, facilitating cooling when you need it, retaining warmth when you need it, and switching between these modes without any conscious adjustment on your part. Leave a comment right now with this exact phrase: "I would not survive 3 days." Write it exactly like that, because until you understand the next layer of complexity, you genuinely wouldn't. Most people focus on temperature regulation and think that's the complete picture. It's not even half. Water is the real constraint, not the heat, not the cold. Water. In the Judean wilderness, reliable water sources are separated by distances that take a full day to walk. Springs emerge from rock faces in locations that are known to local guides but invisible to travelers. Wells exist in valleys where underground aquifers come close enough to the surface to be reached by digging. But between these points, there is nothing. No streams, no puddles. No moisture in the air that you can extract through condensation. You carry what you need, or you ration what you have, or you die. The Tunic and Cloak are designed around this scarcity. Every design choice, every aspect of their construction, serves to minimize water loss from your body. Start with the coverage. The tunic reaches your knees or ankles, covering the maximum amount of skin possible with a single piece of fabric. Exposed skin loses water through evaporation even when you're not sweating. The rate is slower than active perspiration, but it's constant. And in an environment with humidity below 20%, it's significant. By covering 90% of your body surface, the tunic reduces this passive water loss by a corresponding amount. The cloak adds another layer of protection. When draped over your head and shoulders, it shields your face, neck, and upper body from direct sun exposure. This matters because skin temperature drives sweat rate. If your skin stays even 10 degrees cooler, your body produces substantially less sweat to maintain core temperature. But the real sophistication is in how the fabric manages the sweat you do produce. Remember that loose weave in the tunic. When sweat is absorbed into the fibers and then evaporated, the cooling effect reduces your body's need to produce additional sweat. This creates a feedback loop where efficient evaporation decreases sweat production, which decreases water loss, which extends the time you can function on limited water supplies. A person wearing synthetic fabric in the same conditions might consume 3 times as much water because the fabric traps sweat against their skin, preventing evaporation, which causes the body to produce more sweat in an attempt to cool down, which increases water loss without providing additional cooling benefit. Look at the numbers. A person in modern athletic clothing walking through the desert at midday might lose 2 liters of water per hour through sweat alone. Add passive evaporation from exposed skin, moisture lost through breathing, and the total water requirement approaches 3 liters per hour. Over a 6-hour walk, that's 18 liters. But carrying 18 liters of water is impossible without modern containers, and finding 18 liters of water in the wilderness requires knowing the location of multiple sources along your route. The tunic and cloak reduce this requirement by half or more, not by preventing sweating entirely, but by making every drop of sweat more effective at cooling. You still sweat. You still lose water. But the rate is slow enough that 6 liters carried in a goatskin bag can keep you functional for the same 6-hour journey. Now layer on the social dimension. These garments aren't just survival tools. They're markers of identity, status, economic capacity, and regional affiliation. The quality of the weave tells observers whether you're wealthy enough to afford fine linen or dependent on coarse wool. The length of your tunic indicates your occupation. Laborers wear shorter tunics that end above the knee, allowing freedom of movement for physical work. Scholars and religious leaders wear longer tunics that reach the ankles, signaling that their work doesn't require running or climbing. The color of your cloak identifies your region. Undyed wool remains off-white or light brown. Wool dyed with local plants takes on colors that vary by geography, from the reddish tones produced by madder root in some areas to the deep blues created by indigo in others. These visual signals matter because survival in this environment is rarely an individual effort. You need to signal to others that you're trustworthy, that you understand social codes, that you're not a threat. The way you wear your cloak communicates all of this before you speak a word. If you're traveling and you approach a settlement, the residents will assess your garments before they assess you. A well-maintained cloak suggests you have resources and respect social norms. A torn or dirty cloak might indicate desperation or outsider status. The specific way you drape the fabric, the manner in which you fold it over your shoulder or wrap it around your waist, marks you as belonging to a particular community or following a particular tradition. Hit the like button if you're starting to see how much complexity exists in what appears to be simple clothing, because the next level reveals something even more fundamental about how these societies functioned. The cloak has a legal status that supersedes its practical function. In the Torah, there's a specific law that addresses what happens when someone uses their cloak as collateral for a loan. The lender is required to return the cloak before sunset, even if the debt isn't repaid, because the cloak is considered essential for survival through the night. This isn't symbolic protection. This is recognition that without the cloak, exposure to nighttime temperatures becomes lethal. The law acknowledges that debt collection cannot supersede the basic requirement of staying alive. The cloak is legally protected property that cannot be permanently seized, regardless of financial circumstances. This creates an interesting economic dynamic. The cloak has value as a tradable good, but it also has untradable value as a survival necessity. You can use it as collateral because it has worth, but it must be returned because it has worth that exceeds monetary calculation. This dual status makes the cloak simultaneously an economic asset and a human right. You can be destitute, owing money to multiple creditors, with no property except the tunic on your back and the cloak over your shoulders, and the law still protects your right to have that cloak returned every evening. Compare this to how modern systems treat essential goods. Housing can be seized for debt. Vehicles can be repossessed. Even food assistance can be denied based on bureaucratic criteria. But in a society where survival margins are measured in hours rather than days, there's legal recognition that certain items cannot be removed without causing immediate harm. The cloak is one of these items, not because it's valuable in market terms, but because it's valuable in survival terms. The law draws a clear line. Economic systems must bend around human survival needs, not the other way around. This principle extends to how the garments are produced and distributed. Wool and linen production are labor-intensive processes that involve multiple stages, each requiring specialized knowledge. Shearing sheep, cleaning wool, spinning thread, weaving fabric, and finishing the cloth into a usable garment might involve 5 different people with 5 different skill sets. In a small village, this work is often done communally, with families contributing labor at different stages and sharing the finished products. A household that raises sheep might trade wool to a household with spinning skills, who trades thread to a household with a loom, who produces fabric that's distributed back to all contributors. This communal production model means that even the poorest families have access to basic garments because the work of production is distributed across the community rather than concentrated in the hands of a few specialists. You might not be able to afford a finely woven cloak from a professional weaver, but you can contribute labor to community production and receive a functional cloak that meets your survival needs. The system isn't perfectly equitable. Wealthier families still have better garments. But the floor of minimum access is higher than it would be in a purely market-based system, because survival necessity demands that everyone has at least basic protection from the environment. Share this video with someone who thinks ancient civilizations were primitive, because what you're seeing here is a level of systemic thinking that integrates material science, environmental adaptation, legal protection, and economic distribution into a cohesive framework that sustained millions of people across centuries. The tunic and cloak also function as a medical intervention system. Specific illnesses and injuries in this environment are directly related to exposure. Sunburn severe enough to cause blistering and infection, heat stroke from core temperature rising above safe levels, hypothermia from nighttime exposure, dehydration from excessive water loss, skin infections from cuts that get contaminated by dust and sand. Each of these conditions can be prevented or mitigated by proper use of clothing. The tunic's coverage prevents sunburn on 90% of the body. The cloak's insulation prevents hypothermia during cold nights. The moisture management of both layers reduces dehydration risk. The physical barrier of fabric reduces the frequency of cuts and scrapes that lead to infection. There's no formal medical system as modern people understand it. No hospitals, no ambulances, no emergency rooms. Treatment for serious illness or injury is limited to what can be done with local plants, basic tools, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. Prevention is the only realistic form of healthcare, and clothing is one of the primary prevention mechanisms. By keeping skin protected from sun, maintaining core temperature within safe ranges, and minimizing water loss, the tunic and cloak reduce the incidence of the most common life-threatening conditions in this environment. Consider what happens when these garments fail. A torn tunic that exposes your back to direct sunlight, a cloak that's too thin to provide adequate insulation at night, fabric that's been worn so long the weave has loosened and no longer manages moisture effectively. Any of these failures increases your risk of exposure-related illness, And in an environment where medical treatment is minimal, increased risk often means death. This is why garment maintenance is treated with the same seriousness as food storage or water management. You repair tears immediately. You wash and reweave fabric when it starts to degrade. You replace garments before they fail completely. The cost of replacement is always lower than the cost of the illness that results from failure. The skills required to maintain these garments are universal. Everyone knows how to sew. Everyone knows how to identify when fabric is beginning to fail. Everyone knows the basic techniques for washing wool and linen without damaging the fibers. These skills aren't specialized knowledge held by experts. They're baseline competencies that children learn by watching their parents, the same way they learn to walk or speak. By the time you're old enough to travel independently, you can perform emergency repairs on your own clothing, assess whether someone else's garment is adequate for the journey they're planning, and estimate how long a piece of fabric will last before it needs to be replaced. This distributed knowledge creates resilience. If your cloak tears while you're traveling and you're still 2 days from the nearest settlement, you don't need to find a specialist. You can perform a temporary repair using materials you're already carrying: the rope belt from your tunic, thorns from local plants as makeshift needles, strips of fabric from a damaged section of the garment itself. The repair won't be beautiful. It might not even be particularly durable, but it will hold long enough to get you to a place where proper tools and materials are available. The system assumes that failures will occur and builds in the capacity for individuals to respond without external support. Now think about weight distribution. You're carrying everything you need for a multi-day journey. Water in a goatskin bag, food, usually dried bread and dried fruit, possibly a small amount of oil or honey, tools, perhaps a knife and fire-starting materials. The total weight might be 15 to 20 pounds. Where does this weight go? Modern backpacks distribute load across your shoulders and hips using padded straps and rigid frames. You don't have any of this. You have your rope belt and your cloak. The rope belt serves as the primary load-bearing system. You tie the water bag to it, securing it at your hip where the weight hangs close to your center of gravity. Food and tools go into a small pouch that's also attached to the belt. The belt itself is wide enough, usually 3 to 4 inches, that it distributes pressure across your waist rather than cutting into a single point. When properly adjusted, the belt holds everything secure without restricting your breathing or movement. But there's a limit to how much weight a rope belt can support. Beyond about 10 pounds, the rope starts to dig into your skin, creating pressure points that become painful after hours of walking. This is where the cloak becomes part of the carrying system. You can fold the cloak into a sling configuration, draping it over one shoulder with the ends tied together at your opposite hip. Additional items, things that are too bulky or too heavy for the belt, can be wrapped inside the sling. The weight is transferred from your waist to your shoulders, distributing the load across 2 parts of your body instead of one. When you need to access these items, you untie the cloak, retrieve what you need, and retie it. The system is flexible but requires constant adjustment. You can't just load everything in the morning and walk all day. You need to stop periodically, shift weight around, retie knots, and make sure nothing is creating pressure points that will become serious problems over time. The physical toll of this carrying method is significant. By the end of a long day's walk, your shoulders ache from the weight of the cloak sling. Your waist is sore from the pressure of the rope belt. Your feet hurt from walking on uneven ground in sandals that provide minimal cushioning. But this toll is expected, accounted for, built into the planning of any journey. You know that you'll be sore. You know that certain muscles will be strained. You know that recovery will take a full day or more after you reach your destination. This knowledge informs how often you travel, how far you push yourself in a single day, and what kind of rest you need before starting another journey. There's a rhythm to long-distance travel in this era that's completely different from modern experience. You don't travel for weeks at a time. You travel for a few days, rest for a few days, travel again. The rest isn't optional. It's required for your body to recover from the accumulated stress of carrying weight, walking long distances, and managing exposure to extreme temperatures. Communities along common travel routes understand this rhythm. They expect travelers to arrive, stay for several days, and then continue. Hospitality customs are built around this expectation. Offering food and shelter to travelers isn't exceptional generosity. It's standard practice because everyone travels sometimes, and everyone needs the same support when they do. The Tunic and Cloak facilitate this social system by making travelers identifiable. When you see someone approaching wearing travel configuration garments, carrying visible supplies, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who's been walking all day, you know immediately what they need. They need water. They need food. They need a place to rest where they're protected from the elements. These needs are so universal and so obvious that the interaction becomes almost scripted. The traveler approaches. The resident offers water first, because dehydration is the most immediate risk. Food comes next. Shelter is arranged. Questions about where the traveler is going, where they came from, and what news they carry happen after basic needs are met. This script exists because the garments themselves communicate survival status. A person wearing a dust-covered tunic and a sun-faded cloak has obviously been traveling through harsh conditions. The state of their clothing tells you how long they've been on the road, how well they've been managing resources, and whether they're in immediate distress or just normally fatigued. You can assess all of this from 20 feet away before any words are exchanged. The visual language of clothing conveys information that would take minutes to communicate verbally, and in situations where survival margins are thin, those minutes matter. Now add the variable of weather beyond heat and cold. Rain in this region is rare but intense. When it comes, it doesn't arrive as a gentle drizzle. It comes as a sudden downpour that can drop an inch of water in 15 minutes. Dry riverbeds flash flood. Paths turn to mud. Visibility drops to a few feet. And you're standing in the middle of it with nothing but wool and linen between you and hypothermia. Wool has a property that makes it uniquely suited for wet conditions. When wool fibers absorb water, they generate heat through an exothermic reaction. Not much heat, but enough that wet wool is warmer than wet cotton or wet linen. This property is critical when rain combines with wind and dropping temperatures. A wet linen tunic will pull heat away from your body through evaporative cooling, potentially causing hypothermia even when the air temperature is above 60 degrees. But a wet wool cloak will maintain some insulating capacity, and the heat generated by the absorption process partially offsets the heat loss to evaporation. The way you wear the cloak during rain changes completely. Instead of draping it loosely for ventilation, you pull it tight around your body, overlapping the edges in front to create a sealed barrier. The outer surface of the wool becomes saturated, but the tight weave prevents water from penetrating all the way through to the inner layers. You're not dry. Water still seeps through eventually, but the rate is slow enough that you can keep moving, find shelter, and get out of the rain before you're completely soaked. If you stop moving and stand still, the cloak's weight pulls water down toward the hem, where it drips off instead of spreading across the entire garment. The design uses gravity as a drainage system, but linen doesn't have wool's water resistance or heat-generating properties. A linen tunic soaks through almost immediately in heavy rain. This creates a problem. The linen is against your skin. Once it's wet, it stays wet until it dries, and in humid conditions after a rainstorm, drying can take hours. During those hours, you're experiencing continuous evaporative cooling that drains heat from your body faster than you can generate it through movement. The solution is counterintuitive. You remove the wet linen tunic and wear only the wool cloak directly against your skin. The wool's texture is uncomfortable, especially when wet. But discomfort is better than hypothermia. You bundle the wet tunic into your carrying sling and continue moving, wearing just the cloak until conditions improve enough for the tunic to dry. This adaptive response requires you to understand material properties at an intuitive level. You don't have technical knowledge about exothermic reactions or evaporative heat loss. You have experiential knowledge that wet linen is dangerous and wet wool is tolerable. This knowledge comes from direct experience, from stories shared by other travelers, from watching people who made mistakes and suffered the consequences. The learning curve is steep because the cost of mistakes is high. But once you understand the principles, they become automatic responses that you execute without conscious thought. If you watched this far, it's because you enjoyed this case. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can meet you and know who really enjoys the stories on this channel." Hit the like button if this changed how you see ancient survival systems. And share this with anyone who thinks modern technology always outperforms traditional methods, because in specific conditions, it doesn't. These two pieces of fabric, the tunic and cloak, represent something larger than survival tools or clothing items. They represent a complete integration of environment, material science, social structure, legal protection, economic distribution, and medical prevention into a system that sustained human life in conditions that would kill an unprepared modern person within days. The sophistication isn't in any single component. It's in how all components work together, creating redundancy, flexibility, and resilience across multiple dimensions of survival. The tunic manages heat and moisture during the day while providing baseline coverage that prevents sun damage and passive water loss. The cloak insulates at night, shields from wind and rain, serves as a carrying system, and functions as legally protected property that cannot be permanently seized. Together, they create a microclimate around your body that responds dynamically to external conditions without requiring conscious adjustment. The system works because it's designed around constraints that are permanent features of the environment, not temporary challenges to be overcome. Modern approaches often try to dominate the environment through technology. Synthetic fabrics that block all moisture, climate-controlled shelters that maintain constant temperature, transportation systems that move you through hostile environments without exposing you to them. These approaches work when you have continuous access to the resources that power them. But when those resources are interrupted, when the battery dies or the fuel runs out or the supply chain breaks, the protection fails instantly and completely. There's no graceful degradation. You go from full protection to zero protection in the time it takes for a system to stop functioning. The tunic and cloak don't have this vulnerability because they don't depend on external resources beyond the materials they're made from. They work in all conditions, not by preventing exposure, but by modulating it to levels your body can handle. They don't promise complete comfort, they promise survival, and they deliver on that promise through principles that remain valid regardless of broader social or technological collapse. You can lose everything else, all your property, all your tools, all your stored resources, and as long as you have these two garments, you have a foundation for staying alive long enough to rebuild. This is what makes the system profound. It's not just about clothing, it's about the philosophy embedded in how the clothing is designed, produced, distributed, protected, and used. The philosophy says that survival is a right, not a privilege. That essential tools must be accessible to everyone, not just those with economic advantages. That knowledge must be distributed widely, not concentrated among specialists. That systems must be resilient to individual failures, not dependent on perfect execution. That adaptation to unchangeable constraints is wiser than attempting to eliminate them through force. You see this philosophy in the legal protection of the cloak, which prioritizes survival over debt collection. You see it in the communal production models that ensure baseline access for all families. You see it in the universal distribution of maintenance skills that allows anyone to perform emergency repairs. You see it in the social customs that make hospitality a standard practice rather than exceptional generosity. Every piece of the system reinforces the core principle that human life has inherent value that supersedes economic calculation. Now think about what this means for how civilizations respond to environmental stress. When resources become scarce, when climate conditions shift, when established systems begin to fail, societies face a choice. They can try to maintain existing standards of comfort and convenience by extracting more resources, creating greater inequality, and accelerating the depletion of whatever remains. Or they can adapt by redesigning systems around the constraints that actually exist, accepting reduced comfort in exchange for increased resilience, and redistributing access to ensure that survival minimums are met for everyone. The tunic and cloak represent the second path. They're the result of societies that faced extreme environmental constraints and chose to design around those constraints rather than fight against them. The design process took centuries. It involved countless iterations, failed experiments, gradual improvements, and hard-won knowledge about what works and what doesn't. But the end result is a system that works so well, that's so thoroughly adapted to its environment, that it persists virtually unchanged across multiple civilizations and thousands of years. This persistence reveals something important. When a solution is genuinely good, when it truly solves the problems it's meant to solve, it doesn't need constant innovation. It needs preservation. The Tunic and Cloak in 26 AD are essentially identical to the Tunic and Cloak from centuries earlier, not because the people who made them lacked creativity or ambition, but because the design had already reached a level of optimization that couldn't be significantly improved with available materials and technology. Any changes would either add unnecessary complexity or reduce functionality. So the design stabilized, and knowledge focused on maintaining quality rather than pursuing novelty. Modern culture treats stability as stagnation and change as progress. But in systems designed for survival, stability is the goal. You don't want your survival tools to change unpredictably. You want them to be reliable, understood, repairable, and proven across diverse conditions. The Tunic and Cloak meet all these criteria. They've been tested by millions of people in actual survival situations over hundreds of years. The design has been refined through a process that's more rigorous than any modern testing protocol because the tests were real and the consequences of failure were death. This is the final revelation that makes these simple garments significant beyond their immediate function. They prove that human societies can create systems that work, that last, that provide for basic needs without requiring constant growth or innovation or extraction of resources beyond sustainable levels. The existence of such systems demonstrates that the choice between comfort and survival, between individual advantage and collective resilience, between short-term gain and long-term stability, is not inevitable. It's a choice. And different societies at different times have chosen differently. The people wearing tunics and cloaks in 26 AD are not primitive. They're not backwards. They're not waiting to be rescued by technological advancement. They're living within a system that solves the problems most critical to their survival with elegant efficiency. They have knowledge that's been accumulated and refined over generations. They have social structures that distribute essential resources and protect vulnerable members. They have legal frameworks that recognize survival as a fundamental right. And they have material culture that's precisely calibrated to their environmental reality. You can judge this system by what it achieves. It keeps millions of people alive in an environment that would kill an unprepared visitor in days. It does this with minimal resource extraction, using renewable materials that can be produced locally without depleting soil or water. It distributes survival capacity across entire populations rather than concentrating it among elites. And it maintains this distribution across centuries of social and political upheaval through wars, famines, occupations, and regime changes. Because the knowledge is so widely held and the tools are so simple that no centralized authority can fully control or eliminate them. What you're seeing when you look at someone wearing a tunic and cloak is not absence of technology. It's appropriate technology. It's technology scaled to human capacity, designed for human needs, built from materials that humans can process without industrial infrastructure, maintained through skills that humans can learn and teach, and distributed through systems that humans can operate without institutional mediation. This kind of technology doesn't eliminate human vulnerability. It acknowledges vulnerability and builds systems that help people navigate it together. And that might be the most important lesson here. Survival in harsh environments is rarely an individual achievement. It's a collective one. The tunic and cloak work because they're part of a larger system that includes communal production, legal protection, social hospitality, shared knowledge, and mutual support. Strip away any of these elements and the garments alone aren't enough. You can have the perfect cloak, perfectly suited to the climate, and still die if you don't have access to water sources, or if you don't know how to find shelter, or if the communities along your route don't offer hospitality to travelers. The clothing is the visible manifestation of invisible social agreements. Agreements that everyone deserves baseline protection from environmental extremes. That knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. That temporary vulnerability, like being a traveler far from home, creates obligations for those in positions of temporary strength, like residents near water sources. That economic systems must bend around survival needs, rather than forcing survival needs to bend around economic systems. These agreements aren't written in formal codes or enforced by centralized authority. They're embedded in daily practices, taught through example, and maintained through the understanding that everyone is sometimes vulnerable and everyone sometimes has the capacity to help. 26 AD. No synthetic fabrics, just survival in the desert heat, with tunic and cloak in the Jesus era. What looked like primitive clothing is actually a masterwork of material science, environmental adaptation, social design, legal protection, and collective knowledge. What looked like simple fabric is actually the physical manifestation of a philosophy about how humans should relate to their environment and to each other. What looked like limitation is actually a different kind of sophistication, one that prioritizes resilience over comfort, sustainability over growth, and collective survival over individual advantage. This is what you came to understand by watching until the end. Not just how two pieces of cloth kept people alive, but what it means to design systems around real constraints, to value stability over constant change, to protect essentials even when economic pressures push toward elimination, and to recognize that the most advanced solutions are sometimes the ones that work with what exists rather than trying to dominate or transcend it. Check if you're subscribed, because understanding these principles matters more now than ever. Leave that comment. Hit the like button one more time. Share this with people who need to see that ancient wisdom isn't backwards. It's just responding to different questions than modern technology tries to answer. And remember, survival isn't about having the most advanced tools. It's about having tools that actually work when everything else fails.